When considering Lucy Letby's guilt, there is an enormous significance to the multiplicity of the babies which she was associated with by the prosecution. From what I can see, everyone has noted the multiplicity, but they appear to have misinterpreted this data and not seen its real significance for the defence. In this video, I will explain how such an unlikely combination of babies would lead to a much higher neonatal mortality rate than for a normal set of babies, Lucy Letby naturally seeing a much higher mortality rate than a normal nurse or the other nurses on the Countess of Chester rota, and the likelihood that a murderer was involved dropping massively. Let's start with a recap of just how exceptional these babies are. Here are the babies impacted, with twins highlighted in blue and triplets in pink. Where there were multiple attacks that the baby survived, I've grouped up the dates, but fatal attack dates are shown individually. So, we have 8 singles, 6 twins, and 3 triplets on the rota. Now, we have births dated by year, and this shows that twins are rare and triplets extremely so. I've shown on the right what an average set of 17 babies would look like. You'd get 16.5 singles, half a twin, and just 1/100th of a triplet. So the prosecution's case hinges on what is clearly an exceptionally odd collection of babies. And in fact, if you run the probabilities for any scenario with at least as many twins and triplets, then it comes out as a 1 in 2 trillion chance. That's a lot of zeros. If you want to get a full recap of that figure, please refer to my 1 in 2 trillion video. Now you might say, so what? A baby is a baby. It doesn't mean anything that there are an exceptionally exceptional number of twins and triplets. But as I'll show you step by step, this does lead to a string of relevant conclusions for Lucy Letby and her guilt, or not. So what do the independent MBR Race UK reports have to say about twins and triplets? By the way, if you haven't come across them, let me say that these are excellent independent reports which show objective data about neonatal mortality in every hospital in the UK across 2014 to 2017, which is of course very helpful for studying Lucy Letby. A link to this and all my sources is in the notes as usual. On top of this, they do a detailed multivariate analysis of the risk factors of each baby cared for based on a whole raft of risk factors such as gestation period, mother's age, etc. And they also consider multiplicity as a factor. They use this to estimate the neonatal mortality of each baby, so you can be sure that any blips in actual mortality are expected or not. We went over all of this in my Stats 101 video and demonstrated that the public information available did not show evidence of exceptional mortality during Lucy Letby's reign of terror. Now, as we've sadly come to discover in our investigations, this is another example where complex statistics are not explained well. What I would say though, is that multivariate analyses are excellent, they're best practice. It's the same type of analysis that is underlying your car insurance premiums by looking at your particular risk factors and allowing for the historical significance of each to get a true measure of the risk you present. Now, MBR Race don't publish the detailed multivariate results of their analysis, i.e. those independent impacts of each of the characteristics. But they do publish some one-way data showing the crude mortality for neonatals by various characteristics. So unfortunately we can't quite get a pure picture unclouded by the various riskiness levels of the babies in each bucket, but we do get something that is insightful enough to help us. Here's an extract from the 2015 report. We can see in the red circle that mortality rapidly rises with multiplicity, from well below 2 to more than 20 in 2 calendar years. Here's a table of that same data, alongside the 2016 report figures. I've also aggregated this data up and calculated the relative mortality compared to singles. We can see that twins always have substantially worse mortality than singles, and that triplets and above suffer substantially worse again. Now, let's bring in the actual and expected babies, and our huge bias towards multiplicity is going to lead to a massively higher expected mortality rate. We can see that normal mortality is extremely close to 1, due to being dominated by singles. But the extremely unusual set of multiple babies we have has an expected mortality more than 3 times higher than normal. What the prosecution have picked out is not suspicious deaths, but a bunch of high-risk babies where it's no surprise at all that mortality and collapses were rife. So we can conclude that these particular babies brought a much higher risk than normal, and therefore we should not be surprised by them seeing higher mortality than normal either. Now, was Lucy Letby special in treating babies with a much higher risk than normal, or was it a constant across the unit? Let's combine this riskiness information with the biased nurses rota for the Countess of Chester Hospital. You can see we have a new column, NMI, which stands for Neonatal Mortality Index, and we've taken those figures from the MBR Race UK reports just discussed. From this we can estimate the riskiness of the neonatal babies being cared for by each nurse to get a risk index for those nurses. So, nurse 3 in this example has 2 10.565s and 1, making a risk index of 22.1. Comparing this to the actual event she was present at, which was 3, this nurse gets an actual to expected ratio of 14%. We can do the same for all the nurses. Then if we sort and plot the actual to expected ratios, we get this chart. Nurse 3 actually turns out to be the lowest, hence safest nurse of all, once those risk adjustments are made. Lucy Letby, she comes out as an expected of 73.1, way more than nurse 3, which compared to the actual count of 24 for her, gives an actual to expected ratio of 33%. So she's right in the middle, and certainly not an outlier when we allow for risk. While we're at it, it's worth noting this block of 100%, and these are people who popped up just once with an easy baby and then disappear. These are those agency workers we referenced in my Stats 101 video. We can see they get easy babies and so should be ignored from this rota when we're trying to assess if Lucy Letby is normal or not. Let's add up all the nurses by Lucy Letby and look at their average actual versus expected ratio. We get a risk index of 410 against 129 events, which is a 31% ratio. This is basically spot on to Lucy Letby's 33%. And if we just look at an approximation of who are the permanent members of staff, excluding Letby, then we get 30%, not much different again. So we can't conclude that Lucy Letby is seeing much worse experience than expected. She's basically doing as well as we would expect, given the extremely risky hand she's been dealt. Now, we know this rota is biased against Letby, as it doesn't include any of the events when she wasn't present. But using this approach, it doesn't matter. We've shown objectively that Letby is having no more incidents than expected, suspicious or not. Let's relate this all back to what should happen when the police get notified of a suspiciously high level of neonatal mortality in a hospital. So, the staff at a hospital are getting concerned about what they think is an unexpected change in neonatal deaths, and they report it to the management and police. This is exactly what we want to happen. These are precious, extremely vulnerable members of society, so we must protect them. Once the police are notified, they should step through these 4 options. Firstly, identify using statistical experts if there is an unexpected blip in neonatal mortality. In my Lucy Letby Stats 101 video, I explore how this can objectively be done, with the central conclusion being that although mortality was higher than expected during 2015 and 2016, it was not statistically significantly higher than expected. Let's say there was sufficient statistical evidence to pass a statistical test. And maybe you would lower the bar here because of the victims involved. Then we need to ascertain, was it environmental factors? Was the hospital suffering an infection crisis? Was it clean? Was it understaffed? Were doctors and nurses sufficiently qualified and experienced? Was training adequate? Were the correct procedures in place? Were the correct tools and machinery in place? Were the correct medicines available? Now, this is a lot trickier to identify from my objective mathematical viewpoint. I have heard issues raised on pretty much all of these topics, and one interpretation of the data suggests that permanent nurses were working ridiculous weekly hours in this period. However, for now, I'll leave this piece be and assume again that the police found sufficiently little evidence to ascertain blame to environmental factors. So now the police are left with 2 alternatives. The neonatal babies died from natural causes, or they were murdered. Now, why is natural causes still an option here, when if this process is completed step by step, we would have eliminated statistical quirks? Well, this is because randomness still exists. The police might look into hospitals in the top 5% of actual to expected deaths, but we've got hundreds of hospitals, so we will always have some freak results occurring naturally each year, even if everyone is working to the best of their ability. Someone will always win the lottery, no matter how unlikely, and some hospital will always be bottom of the table when it comes to neonatal mortality. It doesn't logically follow that this must be due to a murderer. Let's think about how lots of twins and triplets would shift the balance between these two options. Let's consider murderers to start with. Conceptually, these could be workers at the hospital or members of the public. Now, a non-medical murderer would not know anything about the babies and would just attack randomly. They would not target twins or triplets specifically, and so their chance of attacking such an unusual collection of babies by random is back to our 1 in 2 trillion likelihood. So the chance of a non-medical murderer is basically zero. What about a medical murderer then? They could distinguish the babies by their notes and experience. But then you get into the question of why are they focusing on multiple births? You've got to come up with some kind of theory based on, I don't know, terrible triplets bullying them at school and them focusing their whole life on getting revenge tangentially. It's just not plausible, and no one has ever put forward a reason for Letby hating multiple babies. So murder becomes much less likely, nay, incredibly unlikely, compared to the natural causes option due to the multiplicity involved. Next, we need to discuss correlation. This is a fundamental mathematical concept associated with probability. It deals with how two different random events interact with each other. Two events with a high mathematical correlation would happen often together, whereas two uncorrelated events would occur randomly, such as rolling 2 dice. Rolling a 2 on one die does not imply anything about what will happen with the other die. Now, you can have correlation but not causation. Two events which appear to happen at the same time, but which have no plausible common driver, and so will likely diverge in the future. For example, if a sports team analyses individual attendance records, it would always find some fans who were just always there when they win. But it would make no sense at all to then spend money to ensure those same fans come to matches above all others. Clearly there's no causal relationship, unless maybe it was Taylor Swift coming. What can we say about correlations between murder victims? Would a murderer who attacked one triplet be likely to come back for the other siblings? Well, I don't know about you, but I would struggle to tell babies apart, even more so premature babies. So, a murderer who wasn't a medical expert with a sworn vengeance against twins and triplets would not consistently attack them, and instead would randomly attack many more single babies, since there are just so many more of them. So again, the multiplicity reduces the likelihood of a murderer down to nothing. What can we say about correlations between twins and triplets dying of natural causes? Well, here's one scientific study showing that undiagnosed congenital, i.e. genetic abnormalities, are the most likely explanation of a neonatal death. Twins and triplets would share a lot of genetic information between siblings, and hence be likely to suffer the same congenital abnormalities. So there is a direct and causal correlation between the neonatal mortality of twins and triplets. It would be no surprise at all then if we see one twin or triplet suffering complications that would then see their siblings suffering likewise. So with this unique collection of neonatal babies, we massively tip the balance towards natural causes and away from murder. Why was this not brought up by the defence? Why was this not clearly explained to the judge, who instead, from the sentencing remarks, seems to have brought hook, line and sinker into the Lucy Letby hates twins and triplets theory, which as discussed there is no shred of motive to prove? The fundamental logical train of thought that multiplicity leads to a spike in mortality that is driven by natural causes has just been missed by everyone, with tragic consequences for parents who are misled about the cause of death of their children and forced to relive their tragedies through endless court dates and public inquiries. Not to mention the suffering of Lucy Letby, who has not been given a fair trial and blamed when all the statistical evidence points in a completely different direction. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. This has been a Justice by Numbers production. This is a new channel, so please like, subscribe, comment, recommend, share to help support this channel. and allow me to produce more videos to get to the truth of Lucy Letby's case.